There exists an unusual story throughout all of Europe. If you were born in Europe before the 19th century with a deformity or a neurological developmental disorder, you may have been believed to be a changeling. For across all of Europe, from Germany to Scandinavia, this folktale refused to acknowledge that a child could be born with a disability. Instead, the devil, a troll, or a fairy had kidnapped the child, for these creatures seeked beautiful children, only to replace the child with a child of their own. Many believed this tale, and terrible fates would befall these children. In some cases, they would leave the child, or the changeling as they believed, in the wilderness, hoping it would find its fateful folk family once more. But why? Why does this story exist at all? To understand this story, we have to examine the phenomenological philosophy of otherness. The quality of otherness is an obscure concept. It's an unpopular lens of analysis and an unpopular school of thought. It's normally associated with imperialism, colonialism, gender, and sex. However, the concept itself stretches even farther. Otherness has been described as the condition of disenfranchisement, but it's more commonly understood as the state of being different from and alien to the social identity of a person and to the identity of the self. The notion of the self has roots in many fields of study, but has always essentially referenced the same definition: the individual's own reflective consciousness. That concept is endlessly difficult to unpack. However, broadly speaking, the other can be thought of to be anyone other than you. When analyzing the folk legend of the changeling, the best way to understand it is through the lens of othering. A human was born looking different, and so society identified them as the other. This resulted in the creation of the legend itself, further alienating these people as creatures of myth and legend. It was an explanation for something that society didn't understand, but it was also a tool of discrimination. What this essay aims to explore is that very notion, otherness, and how it's represented in stories. Demon Slayer and the films of Hayao Miyazaki are great examples of modern storytelling that explore otherness and are written with a different portrayal of the other in mind. Yoshida Kaori is a scholar who already explored part of this topic in her underrated thesis, Animation and Otherness: The Politics of Gender, Racial, and Ethnic Identity in the World of Japanese Anime. My body of writing about Miyazaki and Demon Slayer is inspired by and draws from that thesis heavily. Othering is intrinsically connected to the social phenomenon of Orientalism, which fundamentally relies on the fear of peoples and cultures that are both romanticized and vilified. The term has existed for a long time, but since Edward Said's Orientalism, the discourse around Orientalism has based itself around the West's view of Oriental cultures, namely Middle Eastern, Asian, and in some cases African societies. Said suggests that the Western attitude conceptualized an Oriental culture as a foreign institution that could be reproduced and studied in favor of embellishing Western society. The fabrication of this concept favors the notion that Western society, in comparison to Oriental ones, is rational and superior. In Miyazaki's works, the social and cultural other are deeply developed, especially in films like Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind, Princess Mononoke, Kiki's Delivery Service, and Spirited Away. In Nausicaa, the viewer might see representations of the other in the villainous Tolmekians and their focus on military industry. Their priorities directly contrast with that of the people of the Valley of the Wind, who are a peace-loving, nature-embracing foil to Tolmekian society. Kaori suggests, however, that there is an inverse Orientalism that exists in the writing. Indeed, this is further echoed by Miyazaki, who has said that Asians and Africans used to have ways of living that maintained a peaceful relation with nature, which was destroyed by Western civilization. This is also a sentiment that is reflected in the Tolmekians' characterization in Nausicaa and further built upon in the narrative of Princess Mononoke, while also externally suggesting broader social ideas that are ingrained in the Japanese collective memory. Kaori suggests that one could reasonably read the Tolmekians' weapons and the 7 Days of Fire as signifying the atomic bombs that caused Japan so much suffering. Furthering the construction of the Western other in the minds of the Japanese social consciousness, and the idea of an inverse Orientalism in the portrayal of the West in Miyazaki's stories. Both Mononoke and Nausicaa use concepts of cultural and social othering within the narrative of the films themselves. San is seen as a dangerous and hateful figure who resents humankind. Her connection with nature exemplifies her position as the other in human society. Like the Changeling story, San is deeply connected to myth and nature, contrasted to civilization. She is viewed by Irontown as the other, a person who may not be entirely human. Conversely, nature views humans as the other, as they rebel against the environment and destroy natural resources to grow and expand. This facilitates the conflict in the story, much like the conflict in Nausicaa between the Tolmekians and the people of the valley. The people of the valley are also connected to nature, and like San, have a deep respect for it. While San was the individual other, the people of the valley represent a collective other, in contrast with the Tolmekians. Ultimately, Nausicaa and San represent otherness in their respective stories, but they also subvert the typified shoujo heroes and are portrayed as what Kaori calls androgynous female warriors, furthering their representation as the cultural other within the context of cinema and anime. Miyazaki's views towards industry throughout Western society is depicted throughout his films to be damaging and irredeemable. However, his societies that mirror the West, while still constituting notions of a Western other in the Japanese consciousness, are still full of characters with rich personalities. They are kind, understanding, redeemable in their enterprises against nature, and empathetic to the sensibilities of the viewer. This is seen with Lady Abashi of Irontown, who cares for the well-being and continued survival of her people, but by the end of the story, strives to be more considerate of nature. And in the characterization of Nausicaa and her people, who attempt to save the Tolmekian cargo airship full of people despite the danger. In other words, they are portrayed as human. Orientalism gives Eastern societies and individuals that live within them no such privilege. While Orientalism uses the other as a discriminatory tool in socio-cultural discourse, the most predominant and egregious example of othering in filmmaking and mass media is indeed the horror genre, which functions fully off of fear of the unknown and uses that advantage to express its narratives. At its core, the other is the monster of the traditional horror narrative. Historically, this monster reflected the anxiety of society at its time. The idea of the Changeling, the Salem witch trials, and the persecution of witchcraft are all examples of society projecting their fears into dangerous social narratives. The idea of sexuality and gender as the other in horror is also more deeply explored in my other video, Landed Illustrious, the queer body horror. So if you're interested in that topic, go check that out. Within the history of film, this phenomenon remains true also. The Mask of Fu Manchu is one of the earliest examples of Orientalism in horror, and how the villainous other was reflected by American fears of Eastern cultures and traditions. Whether it's the othering of physical disabilities in The Hunchback of Notre Dame, or the representation of androgynous characters as the other in films like Psycho, the horror genre has had a long, complex, and problematic past with how it constructs its villains. However, in 2019, a new catalyst emerged. Demon Slayer. A national phenomenon. Demon Slayer created a franchise in Japanese anime that will go on to create the highest grossing regional film in Japan ever. Starring Tanjiro and his sister Nezuko, the series portrays a neo-Gothic alternative history of the Taisho era of Japan, where an organization known as Demon Slayers hunt and kill demons, who are people that have been infected by demon blood. After losing his family to a demon, Tanjiro ventures forth to find a cure to the demon condition that plagues his sister Nezuko by becoming a demon slayer and fighting and questioning demons he encounters. While the series and film enjoyed immense popularity, critics praised it for its incredible, unique animation and careful character construction. However, while Demon Slayer found critical acclaim, what's less well known is that it's also a horror anime, as its inclusion of traditional horror elements like the monstrous other and the discovery of Tanjiro's dead family suggests to the viewer a nefarious and dangerous world beyond the limitations of the narrative. In the same way that Miyazaki empowers the cultural other in the form of Nausicaa and Princess Mononoke, Demon Slayer empowers many factors of otherness in the construction of its protagonists. The demons are seen as a social other within the canon of its world, but are later understood to be people with a blood disease that enthralls them to infect others. Many demons, including Nezuko, Tamayo, and Yushiro, retain their agency as individuals. Our main character, Tanjiro, is sympathetic to the plight of the other, as his sister Nezuko is infected and transforms into the archetypal monster. He finds ways to resolve conflicts with demons peacefully if possible, and despite the damage that the demon society has done to his life, still values and cherishes demons as people, and his victims to the blood disease of demonhood. This bucks the trend of the monstrous other in horror and furthers the constructive moral of Demon Slayer, to promote empathy and understanding. The empowering of the other in Demon Slayer doesn't end there. We're quickly given characters like Zenitsu, who was raised as an orphan and is considered a social outcast, and Inosuke, who is raised by animals and has an androgynous appearance. The most interesting social other is Kaguya Ubuyashiki, the leader of the Demon Slayers. He's a man with the facial appearance of rotting flesh, and someone who's cursed to live a short life. And while within the context of the story, his disability is not a factor in otherness, it is in the writing of Demon Slayer that makes Ubuyashiki so interesting. For if he were a real person, he would surely be treated as the other within all societies that value appearance. That is to say, all of them. However, in Demon Slayer, Ubuyashiki is intentionally given the most powerful role, as the de facto commander of the Hashira. This, combined with his Buddha-like characterization, seems to be an intentional construction of empowerment towards a traditional representation of the other. In fact, it also seems purposeful that both sides of human society and demon society in Demon Slayer are constructed with the social other in mind, and with the intention of subverting those traditional stereotypes of villainy seen in the horror genre across time. These subversions may be seen as progress towards changing social attitudes on how we should respond to and treat those who may be understood to be the other. With all these elements in mind, it's clear that the horror genre has many developments that yet need to happen in order for it to exist in a socially healthy paradigm in popular culture. However, with time, artists like Hayao Miyazaki and Koyoharu Gotoge, the mangaka for Demon Slayer, have written narratives and characters that rebel against the preconceptions that their own genres restrict upon them. By empowering the androgynous female warrior, which was previously othered, and empowering the monster in horror, an impact is created in our social fabric. The conception of certain peoples and their struggles is recognized. And by empowering characters who represent the other in fiction, writers empower those groups who only now discover representation. It seems that historically, the other is always a relevant character in how people decide to tell their stories. From the myth of the changeling to the mask of Fu Manchu, writers use the other to reflect the anxieties of their respective societies at the time. But it doesn't have to be that way. There is a future that uses the other responsibly instead of as a way to reinforce the fear of the unknown, but as a way to empower and represent those who have been othered before. The traditional writing function of the other is changing, and it's becoming a tool of empowerment, as seen in Miyazaki's films and in Demon Slayer. Those two examples are but two of many that exist today, as writers use the other more responsibly. And while we shouldn't forget the changeling or myths around witchcraft, I wonder why these stories exist and where they're heading. Those myths and legends had a direct impact on people who became real victims because of how they were represented. But maybe those representations are changing, and if they are, then writers have real power to move the needle on issues through how they choose to write the other. That also has a direct impact on people, but this time it's not being used as a tool to discriminate. Instead, it's being used as a tool for empowerment.